Welcome back to Mr. Misfits podcast. We are here, and we actually have a returning guest. I think you're the first returning guest that is not in order. And you aren't even actually really returning because last time you were Pastors Game 2, and now you are returning as Antwuan Malone, Director of Communications for Threaded there in Texas.
That's right, man. Like, this is my alter ego. Like, you met Clark Kent, and now, well, wait a minute. I'm not quite Superman, though.
Yeah.
What's going to be a better... I can't come in as
even know, man.
That's not going to be right.
You started with DC, and so you lost me immediately.
Yeah, we are horrible here.
Yeah.
Well, let's see. Killmonger? No, he never was anyone else.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm at a loss at the moment, but I'm glad to be back. I'm glad to be here.
You're wearing a different hat of your 7,000 hats for the 7,000 jobs that you hold.
They are right behind me. This one, let's see, where is that? That's the symbol for Threaded right there. Yeah. So if you're looking on video.
So Threaded, we talked a little bit about when you were on here with Pastors Game 2, but Threaded is, for our listeners, it's kind of similar to when we talk Tribe Collective, as far as some of the multi-ethnic ministry type stuff. But you guys are doing it much more in a local fashion there in Texas. Give us just a short statement. What is Threaded?
Yeah, so Threaded is a gospel-centered organization that's designed to bring gospel-centered to help people create and get gospel-centered skills and solutions to conflict around race. And so our mission statement is that at Threaded, we inspire relationships, reconciliation, and collaborative action among the diverse body of Christ. And so we've got a couple ways where we help people just take their next step into this conversation, this really crazy, chaotic conversation around racial reconciliation and even racial conflict. And we just try to equip people. We try to be a guide for people to help. We kind of see people who want to see different outcomes in that conversation as heroes. And so we're kind of like Yodas to their Skywalkers, if you will,
I love it.
Where we kind of come in, we're like, hey, this is your journey, and, you're going to maybe I shouldn't say overthrow the race, because that's not quite what I mean, but you're going to have this battle.
You're jumping ahead into our conversation.
I know, right? But you're going to have this battle, and so we just want to help train and equip and do what we can to help you have what you need when you get out there and do these things. So we've got small group material that's been used across the country. We have a really great program called the Threaded Collective. And it's a paid program. It's like $100 a year, but there's like 40 hours worth of content, of resources and videos and webinars and white papers and different things to help you deal with the most pressing issues and bring the gospel to those issues. And so I encourage you, if you're like looking for someone or some way to go forward, man, check us out, wearethreaded.org. And go to wearethreaded.org/collective and consider that, because I think that's going to be for $100, which is not very much, or $10 a month, but it's better to do the annual thing. It's just a lot of resources there. And we do a live Q&A once a month. And so whatever it is you might be dealing with, we make ourselves available to you for that. So anyway, we just want to be, like I said, Yoda to your Skywalker, whichever Skywalker you may be, whether you're Luke or Leia. We can be Yoda to that. So let's get in there. That's kind of what we do.
You're redeeming yourself by going Star Wars out of DC.
He came back around.
So you kind of actually jumped ahead a little bit and gave a little teaser as to why you're actually here. Besides the fact that we just love having you on. I mean, we've done Misfits episode. You were on with me for a Tuesday talk. I think, didn't we have you on for one other thing? Or am I?
I think me and you, we've done two things. We've done two things.
Right. Yeah, we did two things. So now you're back. And part of the reason you're back is because of the stuff that you just talked about within Threaded. You guys are pretty much a parachurch, but more of a community outreach ministry. You guys are doing this, though, with the idea of we're going to take the gospel into the race conversation, and we are going to seek reconciliation through the message of the gospel, first and foremost.
Right.
But now we're going to go, and we are going to jump into one of the most controversial things within evangelicalism right now, which most people are going to say this is the exact opposite of what you guys are doing in Threaded. And part of the reason we're talking about this is because it is not the exact opposite thing that you guys are doing in Threaded. And that is, we are going to talk critical race theory. Dun, dun, dun.
I know. Either everybody leaned in or everyone threw up a little bit in their mouths. Something happened with
whatever they're listening to. So we're actually going to talk critical race theory, though, because I have been having these conversations online. You have been having these conversations online for years. And on top of that, you have been releasing through Threaded with colored commentary, through your personal YouTube channel, which you all should go check out. It's linked also. Critical race theory is a hot button topic. And honestly, part of the reason we're talking about this is because we're not really sure why it is such a hot button topic.
I mean, recently for me, a lot of the conversations has came up politically. We just came off a more local election, and that's what some of the topics were within the states and local communities.
Absolutely.
I feel like that's been the most recent conversation, and you're either on one side or the other. So really, we want to break down today of what does it look like from a biblical view, and not say which camp you need to stand on necessarily.
Right. This is going to be much more of, we always talk about here, we're going to strip the politics out and just look at, throw it into the 3-tier paradigm and look at what are the theological truths here? How do we think about this biblically? And so then what do we do with it? And so the way that we're going to start the show is Antwuan is by far the easiest to listen to expert on this in terms of within a Christian field. You probably would agree there may be people that are more of an expert in CRT that are Christians, but they are very hard to listen to. You, on the other hand, are very easy to listen to, and you are an expert, and you are a Christian, and you're coming at this from an organization that's doing gospel work in the exact area that CRT is supposed to be dealing with.
Yeah.
So we are going to have Antwuan help us dispel some of these myths that the political parties have put into what CRT actually is.
Yeah.
Define it for what it is. And then after our commercial break, we're going to come back and we are going to actually look at why none of that really actually should matter to us in our church conversation. So, Antwuan, we're going to start with the first myth here, which is that it's actually a new thing that has come up in the past 2 or 3 years.
Right.
CRT is not a new thing. Where does it come from?
Well, CRT, so critical race theory started from, in the 70s, and it wasn't they didn't even know they were starting it, So the nature of critical race theory is that it is critical. That's the key word. And so it's always sort of criticizing or evaluating, maybe a better term. Critical has a negative connotation. So evaluation race theory might be a softer version, the way to think about things. But anyway, it starts with an evaluation, a legal evaluation. And so as we're going, as the creators of critical race theory, we're looking at law coming out of Harvard and coming up with a way to evaluate the law in a very specific kind of way as it were pertaining to race. They started to sort of focus and hone in on how the law affects society with a racial dynamic. And of course, as is a legal discipline, or really any discipline, once you hit a focus and a target, then that becomes the subject that you're looking at. So at that moment, critical race theory focuses on race, not so much to have a moral crusade, but it's just the nature of any scientific process, whether it's discovering how magnets work, or whether it's discovering how race affects legislation. Either case, you're zoning in, if you will, on a particular area. So, but it shows up on It shows up in the 70s, and so it's not new at all. It is in response to what laws affect people of color after they were freed from slavery. So the fundamental question, and this is my own words, right? But the fundamental question is, okay, so now that Black people, let's stick with Black people for the moment. Now that Black people are free, what does that look like legally? Is what it's trying to deal with. And what laws were in place, are in place, will be in place that will frustrate that freedom for Black people now that we have entered into this newish realm of freedom, and that's kind of what the conversation sort of is. And it comes again out of Harvard. It's very legal discipline, comes from critical theory a little bit, not nearly as much as is talked about, but yeah, to answer your question, yeah, it's in the 70s, 60s and 70s.
And to clarify also, when you're talking about newfound freedom here, this is both, this is one of the things, because it's a legal thing and because it's an academic thing, there is a little bit of a pluralism here, because it's talking both looking back at history in terms of the Jim Crow era into the segregation era. And then, 1970, by that point, we've got the Civil Rights Act in place. And so now it's also looking at, okay, where has these new laws that are now having to be enacted, are they actually doing what they say they're doing? Which historically, there's not been that much disagreement about the fact that a lot of them did not do exactly what they said they were going to do.
Yeah, and that's not necessarily nefarious. So when people hear, when someone's sitting here and listening to you say that, the race conversation is so weaponized in that it creates villains and victims, that when we say something didn't work, what people are hearing is you didn't want it to work, right? When in reality, evaluation doesn't need a villain or a victim. It's just evaluating effectiveness. And that doesn't require these moral agencies. Sometimes that moral, if you will, these moral motivations, sometimes those moral motivations are there, but other times it's just, you just don't know enough, or it's ignorant, or it's new, and you just haven't learned how to be effective enough at it. The inciting incident, for instance, with critical race theory is Brown versus Board of Education. And it's when, Delgado and others looked at that and said, okay, this law was passed and we want to desegregate schools. That sounds like a good thing from a social moral point of view. But from a legal point of view, the point of it was to provide the equal education, equal quality or baseline quality education for all kids, right? And so if you're going to say, hey, we passed this law, did this law do what we wanted it to do? You got to ask, not did this law desegregate people, because that's not desegregate kids, because that wasn't what the law was required to do. The law was required to produce a education baseline for all kids, so that all kids would get the same, standard education experience. And so you don't look at desegregation as the yay, this law worked. You look at this other thing, and Delgado was like, actually, given our current climate, that law didn't help create this outcome. And it looked like it might have. There's some positive and negative effects of it, but as far as what the law was meant to help facilitate, it actually made it more difficult, because once we chose to desegregate, then that created white flight, and next thing you know, you had all the better teachers here, and you still had this sort of segregated experience, this disparate experience, right? And not that disparity is necessarily negative. It's just that that's not what the law was meant to create. That was what it was trying to correct. And so Delgado starts to wonder, well, what other laws are like that? Where we created a law to fix a problem, but it didn't quite fix it, and someone's got to evaluate that. And so critical race theory was designed to help us understand what those laws, how effective those laws were, and to understand how we make laws, like what are our defaults that would get in the way of us making good laws, so we can go and deal with those things head on as well.
Which that's part of what has re-sparked. Actually, I guess they just threw more gasoline on is more because the fire hasn't been out for a while. Especially in your area down in Texas, is the recent laws that were enacted specifically. You're already shaking your head. You know where we're going. The recent laws that were enacted regarding education and, ironically, CRT. That you and your co-host on Color Commentary did an excellent job actually laying this all out. So we'll that's one of the links in the show notes is you can go back and listen to their episode there. But it was a law that supposedly we can't see their heart, so we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt. It was a law that was enacted with the purpose of trying to, like you're talking about, not cause disparity, but when actually looking at it from a critical legal point of view, it's actually going to cause more disparity. It's not doing what it actually, the ironic thing about that law is that it's doing the exact thing that CRT was designed to evaluate. Let's start, we'll leave that there for a second so that way your head stops spinning with everything.
Is it visible? Do you see me spinning the four responses I have in my head? I'm like, well,
kind of
we're going to go there or there or there, so that we
see it just actually start spinning around. Yeah, let's start the basics here. You've kind of already laid it out. CRT, an actual definition of CRT, it's a legal process, it's a social process, and it's an evaluative tool.
Right. Critical race. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. So definition wise, right? The definition, again, these are my own words. So critical race theory is a legal discipline originally designed to critically examine the positive and negative effects of legislation on race relations in society. In our society. So that's a lot of words. Said even a little less words than that. Critical race theory basically wants to know, does the law help or hurt the racial relationships in society? And it's looking at the laws that we've created to see if those laws are contributive or facilitative to racial disparities that should not exist. And what it isn't saying is that disparity is bad, because we know disparity is a thing. Everybody has disparity. The Super Bowl comes away with one winner. That's a disparative outcome. The elections, they come out with one winner. That's a disparative outcome. Disparity of outcomes are normal. So critical race theory is not anti-disparity. What they're what they're looking for is laws that are designed to actually counter disparities that should not exist. Let's see how effective those laws are, especially as it pertains to race, where race is considered in it, and race relations that come in society. So I hope that makes sense as an original idea. That's the sort of umbrella for critical race theory in the legal sense. And that's about as boiled down an academic definition as I can come up with. Other than that, you go into these paragraphs and paragraphs of things.
Right. No, that's good. And I think that, very makes it plain level for everybody. And I guess my question would be, we know this has been a theory for 50 years now, but again, the topic of conversation has become in our educational system. Has the educational system always been around, or is that more of a new hot topic as far as including that in curriculum? Because I feel like most, we'll just say evangelical Christians would agree that racism was prevalent in America, and for lack of better terms, it was bad or not a good thing. So, and so I feel like people are okay with CRT to the fact that it's this higher power of a legal system, but now education is being involved. So now I want to analyze it further.
Right.
And the people in the conversation around the education, they've sort of politicized critical race theory to take it away from this original definition, because when people get away from their traumatic responses and their erratic, irrational states where pertains to responding to this word or this phrase, once they really sit down with it, they realize there's no way you can teach a law level, law school level theory to kindergartners.
Not just law, Harvard law.
Harvard law, yeah. So and it's a theory at that. So it's not something that is particularly practicable, if you will, in the sense that if you're learning the law, you're going to go to a court, you're going to use the law in court, to make a decision or to make a case or to rail. Critical race theory is a thought, is a theory, it's a way to examine things. So it may or may not be entirely correct in its ideas, and it would self-acknowledge that and be critical of itself. As I started, is evaluative of its own ideas. But so this whole concept of curriculum, critical race theory, is nowhere in anybody's curriculum. And every time I had a conversation with Texas Republicans here. Actually, I've been with some of the Republicans here in the Dallas area and the Democrats. Kind of their things that got brought in to talk about critical race theory. And I have to tell both of them, I'm like, it's not. Some people are like, no, it should be in schools. I'm like, but it's not. It's a non-starter. It's not even in schools. Like the proper definition of it is not even being taught. No one is even. No one's being taught tenets. No one's being taught a way to think about things. The laws that are being created are saying we don't want to have race. It feels like. Let me go away from accusation. It feels like the laws that are being created are saying that we don't want to have conversations where white people look bad. And they're calling any conversation around race where white people look bad critical race theory. If I were to boil that definition down.
Yeah.
And absolutely not. That's not what critical race theory is. That is a proper articulation of your fear around the conversation, perhaps, an unwarranted one, right? But that's not critical race theory. So I think that a lot of the conversation around education has nothing to do with critical race theory, everything to do with protecting people's idea of
that really is a long history of evangelicalism within the church, at least since the Cold War. We're back. I always refer to as Cold War theology. There's replacement theology, all that other kind of stuff.
Yes.
But this fear that somebody is going to get a hold of our kids in the school.
Yeah.
And then that's the end of Western civilization as we know it.
Yeah.
And, I think it may have actually been you, Antwuan, that had posted. Somebody had asked, is CRT the new Red Scare? And I responded, was like, it's not a new Red Scare. It's the same one that we've had since the days of McCarthy, because what are the arguments everybody throws out? It's communist, it's Marxist, it's going to destroy our systems. It's the same argument they used, you already brought up with Brown v. Board. It's the same arguments they used in the Scopus Monkey trials. It's the same arguments they used about prayer being taken out of schools.
Sure.
It's this idea of
it's a moral high ground. It's a battle for moral high ground, and every time America and Marxism is a badder enemy than you've made me to be, and so therefore I'm going to call you that, and redirect the conversation. It is important, real quick, before we move on from this redefinition. I want to read you this quote from, I don't know if you've heard of Christopher Rufo, but have you?
I have not.
I have.
Okay, so Christopher Rufo is this guy. He's anti-CRT. It's the worst thing since the worst thing of worst things. Just he's just like it must go away. It's toxic. All this kind of business. Christopher Rufo goes on Twitter last year, 2019. 2020. Sorry, I never want to say 2020.
Doesn't count.
Yeah. Or actually, you know what? This was actually earlier this year, not 2020. So this is what Christopher Rufo says on Twitter, March 25th. I'm reading a screenshot at his tweet. It says this. He says, "I am quite intentionally redefining what critical race theory means in the public mind, expanding it as a catch-all for the new racial orthodoxy." He goes on to say, "People won't read Derek Bell, but when their kid is labeled an oppressor in first grade, that's now CRT." Now, Christopher Rufo is a political voice, and he makes this. He tweets that he's going to intentionally change critical race theory from what it means to an attack on your kids. And then that was in March. And then he goes on, and in June, right, which is when I grabbed this, he says this. He says, "We have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all the various cultural insanities under that category." Now, this is the playbook. So back in okay, it's one thing when someone says, "Oh man, you're twisting critical race theory." Like, no, you're twisting critical race theory. It's another thing when one of the major anti-critical race theory voices in America, working in government legislation and Republican, in this case, conservative political strategic think tanks, comes on Twitter and gives you the playbook to say, we're literally going to take critical race theory, change it from what it was because they won't read it anyway. This is what he said. They're not going to read it anyway. And we're going to make it about their kids. And then we're eventually going to put everything that we don't like about the race conversation under it categorically. And then we're going to take that to the people, and we're going to completely change everything. I think it's an important thing for us to notice in this conversation that it's not just conjecture that when we're saying, hey, someone's changing the conversation, but it's something that actually was pursued. And I don't appreciate Christopher Rufo because I like intellectual honesty. I do think there are several things wrong with critical race theory that we should be worried about, but I don't think that changing the definition of it,
right,
and charging it with things it doesn't do or say is the best way to go.
And the ironic thing is that, everybody, when you say that, everybody, I sarcastically said earlier the idea of, oh, well, that's just a conspiracy theory, that they're changing this, that this is really the way it is. But the idea of changing a cultural term and twisting into something else, at least for the church, should not be a foreign concept. Because, the whole idea of the name Christian was taking a term that was meant to be bad and turning it into a mark of not pride in a sinful sense, but pride in a humility sense. That's what we're called to do within the world, is to, take, to redeem the world through the renewing of our mind and through scripture and everything else. But when it comes to things that we don't necessarily understand or don't like, then suddenly, if it's possible that we could be wrong, then it's a conspiracy theory of somebody maybe manipulating the culture a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. And in my case, one might come back and they say, man, what you're saying is a conspiracy theory. You're saying that people are intentionally setting out to change. And I would say, I'm saying that because that's what this guy said. Not like it's not
coming from the source himself.
I'm reading like I read you his public quote. This is the thing that he wanted the world to see. He wrote it on Twitter. He said, "Hey, just in case all y'all was wondering, this is what I'm doing with critical race theory. This is what we're going to do." And you could look at that quote and you can say that's exactly what has happened. Especially for anyone who's understood what critical race theory actually is, especially this education conversation is all about the kids now. And it's just everything. It's exactly what it is. And as believers, the truth will set you free, right? Like the number one thing the enemy is about is lies and deceptions and hiding truths. And I think that as believers, we can step into, with the race conversation, we can step into reality and truth and bring light to that reality, even if it's very dark. And that's the beauty of the grace of God and the light that God has given us to shine with while we're here on this earth. And so as believers, we don't need to be afraid of things like critical race theory, the conversations that are being had there. We certainly don't need to engage in deceptive, underhanded tricks in order to somehow manipulate people away from these ideas, we don't have to stab critical race theory in the back. We can fight it head on if it's something that needs to be fought against, and we can fight it, with integrity. We don't have to go and change it and make it to be something that it's not, and fervor, create this fervor and this frothing of the mouth around it in an underhanded way, the way the enemy does things, And so how we choose to fight against stuff is just as important as fighting it, I think, in the Christian world. And I don't think that's how we think a lot of times.
That's where we want to start breaking down here in a minute. We're going to actually start walking into what does this actually mean for the church, because the conversation is very divided and very muddied, and so we want to actually talk about what we actually are supposed to do with all of this information and all these social norms or non-norms and half truths and false truths and everything else. So we're going to take a quick break, and then when we come back, we are going to dive right into the actual theological application of all of this. This episode of the Ministry of Misfits podcast and this awesome shirt are brought to you by Courageous Clothing Company. Courageous Clothing Company is a Christian family-owned business that specializes in custom designs that they create, as well as bulk screen printing of your custom designs as well. When you buy from Courageous Clothing Company, you're not just buying an awesome shirt, you also are helping spread the gospel across the world through the missions that they support, such as this here with Ministry of Misfits, as well as with their own designs that have Christian-themed messages, sharing the gospel in an awesome and relevant way. Or as we say within CSRM and Ministry of Misfits, strategically relevant evangelism. Check out their entire line at courageousclothingcompany.com. All right, welcome back to Ministry of Misfits. Those of you that didn't turn us off after the first 30 seconds when you heard our topic, we are still here with Antwuan Malone, and we are still talking CRT, but we spent the first half talking about what it actually is as opposed to what it is not. And we talked about the fact that this is not a theology. This is a social theory. It's a legal theory, and it's an evaluative tool to evaluate law and evaluate effects of law on society. We talked about a little bit about why the fear of education and how it's somewhat misfounded, as well as how most of the fears are actually misfounded, and that the guy that started the rumors publicly admitted he started the rumors. So now we
Which
want
is
to
still crazy to me, bro. Like I know you're doing a thing, but it's amazing to me. Like I can say that, and somebody will be like, "Yeah," and they'll just not as if I didn't say that. Like
right.
He can say that publicly, and people will be like, "Whatever," and still
want to believe what they want to believe, and
just be the subject of that. It like
there's a verse in there too, which maybe we'll get to today. We'll see. So we want to start talking now about what this actually means from the church, because we already talked about the fact that CRT is not actually a theology, regardless of what some people want to try to claim that it is. A lot of people want to claim it's a false gospel and a false theology. It's neither of those things because it doesn't deal with either of those things. But part of where the confusion gets in is that people do not actually understand what the tenets of CRT actually are. And tenets itself is a weighted word because typically we look at that from a religious point of view, but we're talking legal tenets here. What are the actual tenets of CRT?
Yeah, so there's a list of like 5 in some cases, and other lists have 4. I have a list of 4. There's a 5th one, but one of them kind of, for me, they kind of bleed into each other. So again, as this thing is evaluating into each other, you'll get some of this. It's really difficult, actually, if you look up tenets of CRT to find, an official list, because again, it's a evolving thing. But these are the ones that are probably most prevalent. And so The first one is the permanence, what we call the permanence of racism. And what that basically means is that racism is ordinary and common and not extreme. So when people say the permanence of racism, again, we have to think this is legalese. And so a lot of these terms have a different connotation in the legal realm than they do in common language. And so permanence sounds like something that is inevitable, when in reality, what permanence means here is that it's ordinary. It means that it's not extraordinary or not on the edges. And so most people, when they think about racism, they say, "Oh, racism is Ku Klux Klan, is lynchings, it's calling people the N-word. It's these very extreme expressions of racism." And critical race theory suggests that in an American context, racism does have those extreme expressions, but it also has very normal and more subtle applications throughout life, especially throughout, and therefore can find itself subtly and inconspicuously influencing how we write laws and what laws we create. And therefore we have to be aware that we have that in us, perhaps, and evaluate the laws that we create, understanding that we kind of have that default in us. So that's what the permanence of racism is. That's that one. Number two is social construction, that race is a created social category, meaning that race as a designation is not a natural it's not a natural category like, say, gender is, or like, say, brown eyes or blue eyes or what have you. But race is a social category that has been defined and given value to it by a given society, in this case, America. And as a social construction, it becomes something that someone can come and add to or take value from because they're the creator of that category, as opposed to a more natural category. So race is a social construction. I'm not a Black man by nature. I am an African American, or I'm African, or I have some sort of natural descent. But Black and white are social categories that was used to to understand the society that we were in and to build laws around historically. Number three is counter storytelling, which is this concept that the voices and the experience of the marginalized matter. And so the concept here is that in the past, only the rational mind was the giver of true things. And in this case, you're like, hey, the rational mind is still valid and good, but the voices and experience of the marginalized should help understand what it means to be marginalized, not just the academic analysis of what it means to be marginalized. In other words, if I want to know what it's like to be pregnant, I can write a book about it as a man and try to understand that. But it would be a great idea to go to someone who's been pregnant before and say, hey, what's that about? And have her experiences tell me and inform for me what pregnancy X is like, and not dismiss her experience as something that is has little to no value. And then the fourth thing is interest convergence. It's the idea that the primary instinct of whites is to act only in self-interest. And that is to say that when we've seen critical race theory is saying that when we've seen the white categorical social constructed man act in the interest of racial equality and unity, it's done so from the place that there is a win-win with them, and that there's some sort of interest they have in that conversation that is positive for them, as opposed to one that is purely sacrificial for the sake of someone else. And this is a typical way of just we see this all the time in things. But those are the permanence of racism, social construction, counter storytelling, and interest conversion are some of the things, the four tenets that I usually work from.
Right.
And that's a super quick. Super quick. So if you're thinking through that and you're thinking, man, there's some holes in there, you're probably right. And there's more to expand on all of those things. I'll say this too. This is where these tenets need to be understood as how critical race theory is dealing with the law, not with life. And part of the problem that we get when we get here is when we get theologians come to, they look at these four things and they say, how does this match with theology? And CRT is like, well, wait a minute, we're not talking about theology. It's a little bit like asking, what are the rules of gravity in astronomy? And you're like, wait a minute, we're on Earth.
Yeah,
and so there's a very real law of gravity here on Earth. But when you talk about gravity in space, I mean, it's, those are two completely different observational environments. And so you're not going to be able to look at the law of gravity and apply its principles to Mars or to the stars, right? And even though the law of gravity is real and true. So we have to be careful about bringing theological concepts and making these tenets be commentary to theological concepts when that's not what their intention is. And it's from that you're starting to get this concept of social gospel and all that. Real quick, and I'll let you go. For an example, the conversation of interest conversion. Interest conversions, for some people, when they see interest conversions, what they're hearing theologically is, okay, so what you're saying is that racism was the original sin, the theological original sin that we can't, and there's no way out for me to be saved from my racist sin, right? Because I only act in my own interests, right? And so they bring this concept of original sin to interest convergence, and they say, this is the gospel that you're saying. You're saying that unless I am on board with what you're talking about, I cannot be saved, or my original sin is defined by race, so forth and so on. And it really is just mixing. It's just a bad mix. But you have these really, really smart, well-articulated people who have made these conflations, changed the subject matter to theology instead of legal practices, and caused the whole thing to go awry. So,
so
hopefully that's clear.
So now we're going to do the same thing and conflate theology with what we just talked about. But even with what you're talking about there, because the big one that we always hear about is especially the entrance convergence, and that the idea of, well, you're saying that if I'm white, I'm a sinner just because I'm white.
Right.
If that were true,
that's what not that that's a right statement.
Said, yeah.
That's what the tenant said. Yeah, that's what people say. Yeah.
Even if that were true, and this is where we really want to start breaking down more so even than just the fact that once again we're seeing, especially within evangelicalism, but this extends out beyond evangelicalism. This hits, there are Pentecostal churches that are doing this. There are Catholic churches that are saying this. There are even Orthodox churches that are saying this. It's grown beyond just evangelicalism. But we're just going to focus in there for a second. Even if it were true that it's saying that you as that the original sin was racism, if you are arguing that you are saying, because that's the original sin, I cannot be redeemed from it, and that's what you think it is teaching, your issue there should not be on the idea of that you are a racist. The issue there is because what is being preached is that there's a sin that cannot be saved from.
Right.
We are focusing in on the wrong things here.
Mm-hmm.
And this is really where we get into what we really want to talk about, is that what we hear all the time is everybody keeps on saying critical race theory is the greatest threat to the church. That in itself is a theological inconsistency, even more so than any of the fake stuff they try to throw into CRT.
Yeah. I mean, it's a red herring, because when one says, even if you're working from the paradigm, like what you said, let's just grant the paradigm that the misused and out of wacko paradigm, I think, right? I shouldn't say that. That's very judgmental, but the wrong paradigm. For you to say this is the most important thing centers your experience as, and how you have to ask the question, why is it right? What caused it to raise above all other issues? It's above it's above all issues. This is the number one threat to Christianity now. Critical race theory is, and what it signals to someone is that how you think this affects you, the way you think, the way this attacks, if you will, your sense of self is what you're getting at, or even the heresy that you believe that it may be saying. What you're saying is that unless we get this thing that affects me in this negative way right, then all is lost in Christianity, which really does seem to center the experience, your experience, as the most important experience to protect, more even than Christianity itself.
Well, and really, what that whole tenet within CRT is talking about is the only time that you're looking for a win is when it's a win-win.
That's correct. And so on some level, you are exemplifying the very thing
right.
that it's that is laying out for you.
And even going beyond that, why do we suddenly think that a legal system or a social structure, whether if you want to completely discount the first half of the podcast or not, as far as where we laid out the fact that this is not a theological thing, that it doesn't deal in theology at all. This is all based in legal practices and, legal
evaluation. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. All that kind of stuff. Okay, you can dismiss that whole thing. Thanks for fast forwarding through to get to this part. Why do you suddenly think that these things are a threat? Because the word threat carries the idea of this thing could kill it. If it is a threat to Christianity or to the church, then I think you have got some misguided ideas of what the church actually is. And you probably should go back to episode 22 and re-listen to what we talked about with persecution and what that actually looks like. There is no natural predator for the church because Christ has already overcome. That's the whole point of what we see in Matthew 16. The gates of hell cannot overtake it. If the gates of hell can't overtake it, then a social theory from 1970 is not going to be able to overtake it. We've got to get rid of the idea that because we think some guy says on Twitter that he's going to change the stuff, and now you think that, okay, my kids are in danger because this is happening at their schools when it's not even there yet and can't be there because there's no way a kindergartner can understand this stuff. If you think that is going to cause the gospel to collapse in on itself and the kingdom to crumble, then your faith is not in Christ. Your faith is in something way more fragile. And I mean, we're being very blunt here, but that's because there is no way around it. Now, there are dangers to the local church. And if that's what you're trying to imply, we give you the benefit of the doubt there. There are way bigger dangers than whether or not a theory that is being used is going to be used to evaluate the laws in your city. Because the replacing of the gospel with the Constitution, or the replacing of the, all of these different things, Christian nationalism of I'm an American and then I'm a Christian, or my brother that may be a Democrat is no longer my brother because of who he voted for. Those are way more damaging to the local body of believers than whether or not your government is evaluating their laws with a legal theory.
Yeah. And it's an interesting challenge, what you're saying, like, how fragile is the church really, and if it's so fragile that that this theory can come and present itself as the apex predator to the church, then those of us who see CRT as really relatively minor and sideline on some level, it's like, wait, what? This is the big bad wolf that we got to worry about. Like, it may be a wolf, right? But it's certainly not the big bad wolf, right? And there may be some things in it that you're like, hey, we got let's not go here with this. But when someone says, "Oh no, this is the nuclear bomb of the enemy," he's been sitting around and he's concocted critical race theory as the thing that's going to take out the church, and there's us looking at that like, this isn't not nuclear bomb type of stuff right here. Like, there's some issues, but it is not the number one. Boy, we better get our minds wrapped around this thing, otherwise God's gospel will not go forward. And that is not what this is. And there is this ridiculous sort of extremity that's being talked about when it's being talked about that way. And what that causes us to think about is, it causes people to say, well, why do you make it such a big threat when it's not a big threat? And it ends up saying more about the person who's making that threat than about what the issue is. It ends up saying, you think that you're in threat, or at least that's where it causes us to do,
right?
To think.
Well,
I will say this though.
Good point there too, of really the bigger, if we want to use the word threat that's coming from the enemy, if you actually, the way you say, you could actually claim CRT being the big bad wolf, but not in the theory, in the way that people are reacting to it.
Right.
The politicizing of
it. Exactly. It has the opposite effect.
That is way more of a threat, danger coming from the enemy of disunity, of divert, all these different things that I can't think of all of a sudden. They're math terms. We can't do both legal terms and math terms in the same.
No, not in the same podcast. Our minds blow up.
It doesn't. That is a much bigger danger when we talk about CRT, is the way that we react to our brothers and sisters when we start talking about it.
That's correct.
Theory actually is going to do.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
This theory, and where God kind of gives us specifically commandments of what to do. And we talked about it at our absurd conference of fight for righteousness, justice, and peace. And so if I look at my community and I see this unrest or just things that are going on, it's like, that's where my focus should be and my time and energy, not this boogeyman mentality that something may or may not happen or what this is or isn't. Like, we still have problems that are going on right in our community or right down the road from us. So like, let's focus our efforts there, and instead of this, what it is or isn't.
Seems like an easy thing to do. I'll give this, man. It feels like it's easy. Apparently, it's not. but people have a hard time with it.
Yeah,
I will say this: if one comes to these tenants and they like, oh my gosh, in their view, these are in some ways destroying the gospel. Like I say, interest conversion means that we're inevitably sinners and there's no way out. Counter storytelling. Oh, you want to be you want to be postmodern in your thinking. You don't want to accept ration because you want to validate feeling and experience, and therefore that makes you postmodernist. These are the twists on these. Nobody has a problem with social construction. Permanence of racism, what you're saying is that racism cannot be overcome, and racism as defined by critical race theory is prejudice with power, and so therefore only the people who are powerful are racist, and so they can never not be racist. So when you put all that stuff together, and then you try to put a gospel, you try to sprinkle the 5 points of Calvinism in the midst of it, right? And then all of a sudden now you have this thing and you start to say, man, this thing is actually anti-gospel. It's calling me things the Bible doesn't call me. It says things about my nature that aren't true. And it says the pathway out of that nature is not the way the Bible describes it. If someone decides to go down that road, then it does make sense to me that they will be like, okay, we're going to protect the gospel from CRT. The problem with all of that, which is what we've been articulating, is CRT never sets itself up as a religious contender. It doesn't enter the sport of religion. It enters the sport of law. And so you're not going to take unless you're Bo Jackson, you're not going to take the baseball player, set him in a football field, and judge that baseball player by football rules, and expect to find something that's real and true. And what we're doing, we're mixing sports. We're taking the rules of the gospel, and we're trying to apply them to the CRT. and the way the points are scored, to law, and the way the points are scored in law is different than the way the points are scored in religion, in Christianity, and the definitions are a little bit different. And you're not going to, again, you can't take the rules of one sport, just apply them to this other sport, and then now call that sport a bad whatever player. And I think that's what we're seeing, and it's frustrating to me because it prevents problem solution.
Right.
Because what it does is it changes the ability to eliminate the things that should be easily dealt with. They now become things about me, about myself. This is ultimately a pride and humility conversation. And the enemy just takes things and somehow takes the issue and turns it back on self. When Christ is so adamantly teaching us that the way forward, the way to love and justice is to think about ourselves last, and about how a situation deals with us last, and to accept and work for and fight for the causes and the well-being of others. And that's just part of it. So it's not, people see this CRT thing as something that they need to fight against. I say it's something you need to wrestle with,
right?
But it's not something that I don't see it as anything detrimental to my religious experience or understanding of the gospel. Again, no more than I see, first downs in basketball games. Like to me, it's ridiculous to have a referee who understands football on a basketball court and trying to call fouls in basketball with football rules. That's dumb. And on some level, that's kind of what we're seeing here.
The way pass interference has been called this year, it's pretty. Yeah. Not that we're bitter here in Cleveland. Anyway, we are out of time for today. Antwuan, as always, we love having you on. We'll bring you back for some other talks. We've had you on for a not so serious. We've had you on for a serious. We'll find a middle ground here somewhere.
Well, and this, but real quick, this conversation right here, there's so much more here, right? Like it's it's really hard to hit it, but if I could just say this last thing, right, and then we'll wrap it up. Like, if you are someone who's wrestling with CRT or all of that, what I've found is that oftentimes your problem is not with CRT. Your problem is with the race conversation. And if that's true, then let's evaluate why that is. And let me tell you this, I'll say this too. America, I don't think anyone would say, if 10 is that, hey, if we're on a scale of 1 to 10, and 10 is, hey, we have no racism in America and everything is great, and 0 is the worst, right? We might call ourselves at about a 7 or an 8, right? And that would be great, right? Because that's not where we started. So that means we move from, say, 2 to 8, right? And that's good. Progress is inspiring. And so when we think about history and we tell about our 2, and we talk about the history of moving from 2 to 8, that's good news. That's not something to be ashamed about. That's something to be inspiring. That's a legacy to pass. That's something to say, hey, we have been overcoming this slowly but surely, and we're almost there. You're the next generation. Keep the party going. We want to continue to distance ourselves from racism as much as we can as a nation, and we don't want any of it, no traces of it, as much as we can allow it in our system. I don't think that anyone in America who's right-minded would counter that idea. Right. And so we don't have to look at history as something to be ashamed of. We can look at history as something to be inspired from, even if it's ugly. And so if you're sitting here worried about CRT, worried about what is being taught to your kids, whether they're going to hate themselves, listen, white people were a huge part of moving from 2 to 8. Right. And your kids have that heritage to look at just as well as they have a heritage to look at, say, of bad things happening. And so you don't need to be afraid of this conversation. You don't need to be afraid of, we do need to think about age appropriateness and all this sorts of things. But we are on this journey together as a nation to alleviate racism. It's not something to be afraid of. We can be inspired by it. Progress is inspiring, not belittling. And so we see progress. Let's celebrate progress and continue progress. I think that's an easy way to think about the conversation. And therefore, when you see CRT is your weapon now against racism, not your weapon against white people. and that's not how it's meant to be done. So I wanted to kind of put that out there, maybe a more positive note to say, hey, there's a way to think about this with hope and with inspiration instead of fear, and instead of fear.
Yeah, that's very well said. I appreciate that.
Yeah, we need to ask James Talbert where he gets his little praise button that they've got for Bless Up, because that would have been right there where to throw it in. The whole Pentecostal praise organ, that would have been then. Antwuan, we're gonna link, if you want to check out more about Antwuan, about the stuff he's doing. He still is doing Pastor's Game too, although Facebook's being stupid again. So go follow him on his other channels.
Yeah,
you can also
give me on YouTube and rescue me from Facebook, because I think I'm gonna have to get off of Facebook, but I don't have my audience on YouTube quite yet.
You can also follow along with this exact conversation on the other podcast that he does, Colored Commentary. You can also go to his YouTube channel and check out a different YouTube channel and check out more on these exact things we're talking about as far as the tenets and what that looks like biblically, things like that. All of those links are in the show notes. The links to contact us are in the show notes. Yeah, we will be back next week, and I don't remember what's next week, so we'll be back though.
Yeah, it's coming up. We've also got Giving Tuesday.
Yes, Giving Tuesday. Yeah,
that out, and we're gonna do maybe 12 days of Misfits, something like that for Advent season.
I'm gonna challenge Brandon's Christmas and Bible knowledge at the same time.
Yeah, interesting conversation for the month of December.
Yeah,
so prepare yourself.
Yeah. Hey, Antwuan now is glad that he's only a guest and not here all the time. So,
hey man, I'm always here for a little challenge.
That's right. We will see you all next week.
Ministry Misfits podcast is a production of Overwhelming Victory Flicks, Overwhelming Victory Radio, and Ministry Misfits Media. Dr. Greg Linville and Andrew Fouts are our executive producers, and Brandon Simmons is associate producer. Our music is provided by Morning Light Music and is titled Rain. If you would like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ministrymisfitmedia@gmail.com or by following @ministrymisfit on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can support Ministry Misfits at anchor.fm/Ministry Misfits or for FO1C3 credit by going to csrm.org/donate and selecting Andrew Fouts in the campaign menu. To learn more about Overwhelming Victory or to listen to our sister podcast, visit overwhelmingvictory.org.